Greetings, humans.
And any ghosts or malicious AI tuning in.
You're listening to Shout for Libraries on CJSR in Edmonton.
With Belinda Ongaro,
Dan Hackborn,
and Timothy Arthur.
For those of you who haven't tuned into Shout before, every month we pick a topic relevant to librarianship and information studies.
We are a group of Masters in Library and Information Studies students here at the University of Alberta. And every month, we bring you fresh library and information studies-centric news. It's Fundrive, and we're recording this 1-hour special under the full moon on Halloween night.
And in classic 2020 fashion, we've decided to have a video call to share some scary stories that we prepared, campfire style. All right, just let me screen share this fireplace sound generator. 1 second.
Ooh.
And we're good to go.
It's like the real thing. In our previous episode, we threw it back to some haunted library stories from season 2 of Shout. Can you believe we're on season 5 this year? Let's make it 6 seasons and a movie, hey, potential Fundrive donors?
Now, brace yourself for some blood-curdling, hair-raising tales of horror about cursed media.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dan, how about you go first? I'm in the middle of roasting a vegan marshmallow over my space heater. It could be a while.
All right, I heard this one from a friend of mine. There's something electric about the illicit thrill of knowing something you shouldn't. You see the trope reassert itself time and time again across genre and media. Forbidden romantic intrigue, the spy who learns too much, a poor academic driven mad by the knowledge of some existential terror. This narrative is so powerful that, at times, it crosses over, infecting the format itself, giving rise to tales about a cursed medium, and thinking along the lines of the Signal of Videodrome, or the haunted cassettes of the Ring franchise, or the eerie lost children's program known as Candle Cove, or even some of the more outrageous rumors swirling around the dark web. And while there must be something even more primordial, a whispered story that the listener cannot unhear, something glimpsed that cannot be unseen, the artifact that holds the most magnetism for librarians, maybe even for Western culture, is the cursed book. Whether it is an unholy description of events or a grimoire containing ritualistic means to power, the idea exerts a gravity that ranges across fiction, perhaps most famously as H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon or Robert Chambers' play, The King in Yellow. But what do these things look like in real life? And I'm not talking about the forbidden books you'd find on the Vatican's prudish Index Librorum Prohibitorum, most of which are censored due to erotic content or content that runs counter to established Catholic dogma. I'd like to take this time to talk about how the tropes and stereotypes look in the harsh light of day. Does an authentic manifestation lose something, reality removing something of the aura of fear, or does the fact add a certain spine-chilling tremor? So I'll ask you to take a moment and imagine in your mind's eye the platonic ideal of the evil book, set upon a lectern, flickering candlelight illuminating the object. It is heavy, obviously, with a thick cover bound in some sort of leather. So this characteristic is one of the first things to address, anthropodermic bibliopegy, also known as binding a book in human skin. Though rare, yes, examples absolutely exist. Megan Rosenblum, a librarian, has written an entire book on the subject called Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. So if the topic appeals to you, I'd heartily recommend it. Typically, as it turns out, these morbid tones are more likely to be medical texts created by 18th or 19th century doctors than a warlock spellbook, which, makes sense if we think about who had access to corpses combined with the knowledge and arrogance to make such an item. So perhaps surprisingly, books bound in human skin tend to fall in the realm of science rather than the supernatural. Let's return to the hypothetical mysterious book that occupies your thoughts, fills your waking hours. Another common characteristic of these items is the idea that they inspire an obsessive and feverish compulsion. An excellent historical example of this is a book that has been carbon dated to the 15th century. It is written in an indecipherable language and contains curious illustrations upon its vellum pages. It is known as the Voynich manuscript. Allegedly created during the Italian Renaissance, the Voynich manuscript has cultivated an aura of mystery due to the repeated attempts to decipher the language, which have all been unsuccessful, even when undertaken by professional linguists and cryptographers. The language is not a simple substitution cipher, rather, grammatical and statistical properties appear to propose a structure similar to the romanization system used for Mandarin Chinese. Since the text is unknown, the illustrations are used by Voynich scholars to organize the text and suggest some sort of unknown cosmology. Some have attempted to claim the entire manuscript is elaborate gibberish, though this begs another question regarding the nature of obsession. What would cause an individual in the 1400s to write 270 pages of gibberish? Who would have the time and resources for such an endeavor, and to what end? The Voynich manuscript is now housed at Yale University in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it continues to frustrate all attempts to interpret its secrets. So this idea of hidden knowledge also comes with a compelling counterpart that occurs frequently in narratives about cursed books. What if said knowledge is hidden for a reason? What if it is dangerous, even evil? Which brings us to the Grand Grimoire, written sometime between 1421 and the early 19th century. Although other grimoires have long been a fixture in the Western supernatural imagination, the Grand Grimoire, also known as the Red Dragon, is a particularly fun example, since it contains instructions for the most infamous supernatural and cursed act of all. Its primary purpose is providing instructions on how to make deals with the devil. Yes, it is essentially a bargain with Lucifer for dummies. While other grimoires, like the Keys of Solomon, may include some information of this sort, there are also instructions for a number of different, often more mundane tasks, like finding stolen items, or love potions, or ceremonial perfume. The Grand Grimoire flips this, being notable for having a specific focus on this one thing that is pretty consistently agreed to be a very bad idea, and going into what must be a fair amount of detail on the subject. Not only does it distinguish between several aspects of the devil that you can summon, but it also gives details on constructing tools to coerce said devil into doing your bidding, and the delicate art of drawing up an agreement with your infernal business partner. There have been several modern print editions of the text, and you can even access a copy on the internet, if you dare. So this is all well and good, but do any real cursed books exist? Well, consider The Orphan Story by Martin de Leon y Cardenas, and decide for yourself. The Orphan Story was written between 1608 and 1615, so if it had been published at the time, it would have been a contemporary of the granddaddy of the modern novelistic form, Don Quixote by Cervantes. If, that is. Though it was set to be published, it never made it to the printing presses for unknown reasons, and the manuscript disappeared from history until its rediscovery in the 1960s. Following this, several prominent Spanish scholars and academics attempted to finalize the publication of the novel, due to its pedigree and potential place within the canon of the modern novel format, as well as the perspective it provides into colonial Spain. However, all of these individuals died from strange diseases and car accidents while attempting to finish publication of the novel, including Antonio Rodriguez Monino and Professor William C. Bryant. While the content of the novel itself, a fictionalized narrative of the author's own life, doesn't seem too supernaturally sinister, this string of deaths has led to rumors of a curse. In 2018, The Orphan Story was finally published, centuries after its writing, due to the work of Belinda Palacios, who has thus far circumvented the curse, perhaps breaking it once and for all. She reported that she was warned several times during her work by her peers about the potential cursed nature of the book. So do curses actually exist? Allow me to cop out with an I don't know answer. What would a curse look like in real life, stripped of any supernatural agent? Let's return to The Orphan Story for a second. The book is an account of the Spanish colonization of Peru and Bolivia, offering an uncritical perspective on some of the causes, including an insatiable desire for so-called adventure and wealth, which would ultimately lead to the horrifying abuse of local indigenous peoples. The author discusses the awful conditions in the silver mines of Potosi, conditions which would lead to the Quechua name for the mine, the mountain that eats men. Over the course of 70 years, this small Incan hamlet would grow to the fourth largest city in the so-called Christian world at the time, leading to the enslavement of thousands of native people and abducted Africans. This is a pattern that would repeat over and over again throughout the European colonization of the world, the causes and consequences rippling throughout generations, wounding entire nations and landscapes. Is there any word that comes close to capturing this kind of multi-generational trauma? A term that signifies consignment to an evil fate, or an evil which has been invoked? What does a curse look like in real life? And who would bring one into being?
That was both unsettling and truly thought-provoking, Dan. Thank you.
Timothy, why don't you go next?
All right, my story sort of flips the idea of a cursed book on its head because it's about the dark side of a medieval manuscript that warns against witchcraft. And that manuscript is located right here in Edmonton. So I spoke earlier with two researchers who discovered it miscatalogued in the University of Alberta Library's special collections. Here's a recording of that conversation. I'm Timothy Arthur, and I have the pleasure to be joined in a call by two scholars of medieval history, Francois Pageau and Dr. Rob Desjardins. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting us.
So first of all, can you each introduce yourselves? Who are you and what's your background in studying medieval history?
My name is Francois Pageau, as you said, and this is my second career. I was in the media. I was program manager at CBC Radio-Canada for a number of years in Alberta. And I got tired of the cuts, so I decided to leave that and go back to my first love, which was history, more specifically medieval history. So I did my master's in pre-modern history, and I'm doing my PhD right now, 15th century Europe and intellectual networks.
And what about you, Rob?
And I'm Rob Desjardins. And yeah, like Francois, my involvement in history is kind of like a second track in my life. I've worked for a number of years as a graduate writing advisor in the Academic Success Center. Right now, I'm a communicator with Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research, but decided a number of years ago, because I really had a love for things medieval and things historical and things textual, to take an opportunity to study it intensively. And it was a great way to kind of decorate our lives with all this interesting material.
And what is interesting is that we didn't study together. There's, we've got a few years difference, and but we happen to be working with the same person who was our supervisor, Andrew Gow, and it's through him that we met and we started working on Tinctor's treatise.
Oh, absolutely. That was, Andrew was sort of the connecting thread that brought Francois and me together. And we've been good friends and colleagues for a number of years now.
So Tinctor's treatise, this is the sinister manuscript that you uncovered in the Bruce Peel Special Collection of the library. Rob, so you were, I understand, the first to sort of come upon it and rediscover it. Is that right?
Sort of. And I wish it were a story that involved me kind of hobbling down the aisles and finding this book kind of buried in a stack in the back of an aisle in the Peel. What actually happened was, this is back in 2005, so 15 years ago now, the Peel was putting on a sort of an open house, a tour for new graduate students at the U of A in medieval studies, in English, history, and other fields. And I happened at the time to be working with Andrew, looking for sort of books that he could use for his undergraduate teaching. So I was checking out what the Peel had to offer. And I was completely amazed to see the range of early modern holdings at the Peel, these old books from the 16th century, the 17th century. And what blew me away as a person who was studying Burgundian history in the 15th century is that the U of A had two Burgundian manuscripts, full Burgundian manuscripts from the, a spectacular sort of court of Burgundy, a place where even as it was sort of the era of the sort of discovery of the printing press, still in the 15th century, luxury books that were produced by hand still had a certain kind of cachet. They were prestige items, and two of those items that had been produced in the court of Burgundy, this rich center of book production, were right here at the U of A. One of them was this sinister old book, Tinctor's book.
Mm-hmm. So you came upon it in the library, and it was miscatalogued. Is that correct?
Yeah, precisely. It had been sort of understood to be a book, was labeled to be a book of sermons against a sect of people, a sect of sort of Christian believers. It was founded in the 12th century, kind of flourished in the 13th century, called Waldensians. Waldensians believed in all kinds of radical and crazy ideas, like the equality of the sexes, and that priests shouldn't be rich men. I mean, just, that the average person should be able to preach the gospel, things like that. So they were persecuted by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. So to come upon, a book of sermons against Waldensians doesn't seem like such a strange thing, except that upon opening up the book and looking inside, the contents didn't seem to match that description, and the contents seemed bizarre and kind of otherworldly. There were references to all sorts of things, even in kind of the table of contents at the beginning of the book, that I couldn't understand at first. It was talking about Antichrist coming. It was talking about demons performing all kinds of nefarious acts in the world. I was like, what is this about? I was puzzled. So our supervisor, Francois, and my supervisor at the time solved the mystery when I brought him in to look at the book. And it turned out that, this wasn't a book about Waldensians at all. It was one of the earliest books written about what would later come to be understood as diabolical witchcraft, the kind of witchcraft that was imagined during the burning times, during the persecution of witches in early modern Europe.
So then, Francois, how did you get involved in the project of researching the manuscript?
Yes, although Rob was still working with Andrew, he was not in any kind of hierarchical position, but I was. And since I had a lot of interest in demonology, and also a knowledge of Middle French, which is quite interesting because the manuscript is in Middle French. Andrew said, maybe we should get together, the three of us, and look at the manuscript and do what they call a concordance, look at other manuscripts, other copies of the same manuscript elsewhere in the world. There's a copy in Paris, another one in Brussels, and there's one in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, right? So we started working together that way, and we call ourselves the Tinctor Project because we basically worked a couple of nights every week for years on up until we had enough material to publish a book about that manuscript and some other things. So that's how I was involved, and the three of us have been working together for 15 years now.
So then that book was the Arras Witch Treatises, right, which you published in 2016. And that included another text translated from, we'll get to this, with the same trials that the Tinctor's Treatise came out of. So I have to say that I really enjoyed your translation. I thought it was extremely readable. I actually enjoyed reading the text a lot, so thank you for that. So who is this mysterious Tinctor who wrote the treatise?
I was just going to say, well, Tinctor is quite a respectable theologian, 15th century theologian who was from the Duchy of Burgundy, which is today, most of it is Belgium, or the northern part of France. And he was quite respected. He had been dean of the Cologne University in Germany. He wrote about Aristotle. He wrote about Albertism and Thomism. So he was well respected, but he was also a firm believer in witchcraft, and that society at the time was under attack by literally thousands of people that were devil worshippers. And when he wrote the book, it was following a trial that was happening in Arras, which was a city in the Duchy of Burgundy, not too far from where he was. And he wrote it to convince people that there was a good reason. He came up with arguments saying we have to do these trials, we have to persecute these people, because otherwise we are doomed, and the devil will take control of our society. So I think his own personal beliefs were sincere and genuine. Unfortunately, what happened in those trials in 1460-61 is that it was started by inquisitors and by people that had a bit more power than usual, because the bishop of Arras was away in Italy. So they took upon themselves to start, asking a lot of people to denounce other people and to make sure that they were going to arrest everybody that was involved supposedly in the Sabbath, which is the nightly gatherings of witches. By the way, at the time, witches were not just women. It was women, men. There wasn't yet such a concentration of women considered to be witches. And they got to a point where they had the first wave, they had maybe, 10, 15 people that they had arrested, tortured, and they wanted to stop. So they went to see one of the lords that was responsible for the area, and he saw clearly a way to arrest more people, but people of means, to get money and to basically enrich himself and his minions. So it was co-opted by the temporal powers, clerks and lords. And that's where we see that even though some of the clerks, religious people did believe in it, it was the lords that said, okay, keep going until you get up to a lord and we get the money we want. Rob, anything to add?
That was great. I would just add too that, one of the really interesting things about Tincture is that, as Francois said, this is a guy who, as far as we're concerned, as far as we can tell from all the biographical records that we have, was not a fanatic. He wasn't some sort of sociopath. He was a well-respected and probably well-intended intellectual, but he was doing the work that he was doing was sort of extremely sinister in its own way, because before this time, before the 15th century, the idea that we have of witchcraft today sort of stems from this period, the idea of diabolical witchcraft. So the idea that, for instance, there's this sort of depraved group of people who go out and fly on brooms and cast spells and hover around cauldrons and, drink children's blood and have orgies, all these sort of horrible ideas. They hadn't really existed in a coherent form before the 15th century. All of these ideas kind of came from a group of different medieval sources, and they had been put up in different contexts as accusations against groups of others, against other people, sort of heretics, Jews, even Christians in the late antique period. But they were all a sort of a disparate group of stories that sort of just came down, and it took intellectuals, it took university people, it took churchmen like Tincture to create a whole coherent narrative about what witches do. And this hadn't really been done before the 15th century. And while Tincture wasn't the first intellectual to start doing this, he was among the first. So to make a sort of a narrative of oppression that would really stick for 200-300 years after this, it took an intellectual like Tincture to do it. A well-intended intellectual, but there you go.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of Tincture is really in the, let's call it the archaeology of the construction of the witchcraft that we know today. Because before, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, everybody was talking about the Malleus Maleficarum, which was the hammer of the witches, written and published in 1487. So everybody said this is really the first one. But what we've been working on are books. There's a handful of books like Tincture, who basically already have most of the notions, most of the intellectual constructions that you will find in the Malleus already there. But it will take another 2 generations before it will be, in a sense, accepted as common sense, that there are witches and we should eradicate them. Mm. So this is the interest from a historian's point of view, is the archaeology of this construction of the concept of witchcraft.
Just one more quick point to expand on that one bit more, is that we often think of even Monty Python, right? Everybody thinks of witchcraft as something coming from the Middle Ages, right? It was an invention that superstitious peasants and rubes before the Renaissance, before the age of intellectuals would have come up with. In fact, you go 100, 200, 300 years before Tincture, people would have said, that's ridiculous. The church would have dismissed it out of hand. Nobody talked about these things happening until some intellectuals in the 15th century gave them credibility by drawing them all together and tying these really elaborate arguments together as to how you can justify a claim. For instance, that somebody is going to get on a broom or be carried through the air in the dark of night to go to an orgy. It takes an intellectual to make a society believe something like that. And that's what happened only in the 15th century.
What must be said of the context at the time, because, that's the question we ask ourselves. Why at that particular period did people start to believe these crazy stories? Well, I'm tempted to say, talk about fake news and everything that we're living right now. And you kind of understand better today. I mean, really today in 2020, a lot more than, let's say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you would have understood why people can believe crazy stories. Because we are witnesses of what's happening with the QAnon thing. And people truly believe there's a ring of pedophiles that goes up, the American government and pizzerias and the Clintons and everybody. I mean, it's ridiculous. Or they also believe that there's lizard people that are hiding and they control the world. But they do believe that, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people believing that. So in a sense, it's easier today to understand what was happening in the 15th century and what we can compare those two radically different times is the insecurity. There's a great insecurity happening. At the time, it was the church felt that it was losing control of lay piety because people were taking upon themselves. They invented new rituals like the rosary and other things. So the clerks and the clerics felt they were losing control. And at the same time, they felt it was the rise of the Ottoman Empire they were getting closer and closer. Constantinople was lost. It became Istanbul. So they were at Europe's door. So there was a sense of panic, of paranoia, which I think was fertile ground for those kinds of ideas to gel and to come together.
That's really interesting, because I was going to ask you just that, which is, since you published this in 2016, I was wondering if it had colored your perception of events since then. What about you, Rob?
In so many ways. We, about 4 years ago, when American politicians were suddenly talking about the efficacy of torture and waterboarding, for instance, we wrote a op-ed piece that didn't get accepted by the New York Times, but we tried, in which we looked at not exactly the Tincture manuscript, but an associated document that we're also translating, which is a set of records of the witchcraft trials that happened at us. And it's remarkable to look at the kinds of things that the defense attorneys argued in the 1460s. The things they said about the fact that waterboarding and torture don't produce reliable evidence wouldn't be out of place today in sort of an Amnesty International case. Okay, so there are so many resonances with the current day. Francois brings up sort of the idea that we have right now this sort of epidemic of fake news, of people buying into sort of paranoid conspiracies. And I guess I would add to that what we see, especially in Tincture and in all the Arras documents, is that one of the important ingredients in a good conspiracy theory is some sanction from a powerful, well-respected, articulate individual. One of the things we have to remember is that logic based on faulty premises can take you in all kinds of really weird and disturbing directions. Johannes Tincture is a tremendously effective logician. His dialectics, his reasoning is perfect, and yet he's able to conclude, for instance, that people are stealing off in the dark of night and, worshiping the devil in the form of a goat. He's able to use logic to prove that. He has some faulty premises. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that are happening today now, and a lot of the kind of types of authority that people will sometimes appeal to, that we have to be really careful about appealing to that sort of authority in and of itself.
I'd like to talk about the fact that we did do the book. It was published in the States, and it's all dandy and great. But what we're also very proud of is the online exhibition that we worked on with the Bruce Peel Special Collection Library, and for which the library won a prize. And for us, it's a great way to reach more people, because it's a way to talk to the grand public, the public at large, instead of a public of specialists. And this is the kind of collaboration that we are actually wanting to do again. We've developed a project. We just need to finish the second book on those trials. And after that, there is another project on the shelves with the Bruce Peel Special Collection Library. And it's a great way that they have found to reach people not only in Alberta or in Edmonton, but throughout the world.
And since you mentioned the Bruce Peel Special Collections Library, let's go back to the manuscript itself. So this particular manuscript housed in Edmonton, what is special about it?
So Francois talked about kind of the work that we've done with it. It's all been a delight. It's all been so much fun. Some of it's been pretty grueling work, though. So when he talks about doing concordances, one of the things we had to do to kind of get a sense of where this one French copy of Johannes Tincter's treatise. There are only 4, as you said, there are only 4 French copies, handwritten copies that still exist in the world. We were trying to establish what relationship did it have with the other ones, right? The process of doing that is kind of, it's grueling, but it's also really interesting. You essentially sort of have to go not just word by word, but almost letter by letter and compare each text to the other texts. And talking about logic again, this is really interesting kind of logical problem and process, because what you start to see taking shape when you compare the texts that closely is you realize, wait a second, the most closely related version of this text, clearly because of some various kinds of sort of evidence that we have, evidence in the illustrations in the paper and other things. The closest related text is the one that scholars felt previously was the oldest text, and that's the one that's housed in Brussels. We start comparing it closely to the Brussels text, we realize a couple of things. Number one, the kind of calligraphy and design of our text is superior to the Brussels text. But not only that, you go word by word and you start to notice that there are phrases that are missing from the Brussels text that aren't missing from the Alberta text, but not the other way around. And what we realized from that is that our text couldn't have been copied from Brussels, but because of a set of other circumstances and evidence, we know that Brussels probably was copied from ours. So that led us to understand that how this strange text that took a very strange and circuitous path to get from the Low Countries into England to Canada eventually was probably out of the existing copies of Tincter, the French copies, this is probably the oldest one, which is really cool. It's a small thing, but to realize that Alberta has this really, really old manuscript is really exciting.
You know, we're almost sure that it basically found its way that it was produced in the Duchy of Burgundy, but probably for an English client, because the little finestra, the little window in front of the book with the title, is in Anglo-Burgundian. So it's a mix of, French and English in a sense. And it's probably one of the reasons why people lost track of it, because it wouldn't take long with the Reformation, the English Reformation, when people started to loot abbeys and take all of the books and everything. So it probably fell into the hands of somebody else, or it was taken from, let's say, somebody close to the royal family, because the York family had very close ties with the Duke of Burgundy. So we think, with the War of the Roses, it went one way and another way, so it got lost there, and we lost its track for maybe 200 years, more or less. And then we find it in Wales. And from Wales, we have a couple of, 18th, 19th century. Well, we have, information, but then we lose all information about it up until the time that an Englishman comes to work in Canada, Dr. Lunn. And that's where we find a trace again, but it's only from the 1960s up to today. So we're still working. It's a very hard process because there's little information, except there's still ownership inscriptions in the manuscript. So some of them are easy to find. Others are still a mystery to us. But I think it's the only way we are going to eventually get more information on ownership is by identifying those names, which are really difficult. And there's some of them are like monograms made with letters. So it's also a puzzle.
Could you talk about those monograms? Because I found that really interesting.
Yes, the monogram is really tantalizing, because you can identify a few letters, but it's like a design. You have like 4, 5, 6 letters all written together to create a logo kind of thing. And it was a fashion. It was very in for people to do that already by the end of the 15th century, all the way to the 18th century. So I've started looking in so many places, and we've contacted people that are specialists in recognizing those monograms, and we haven't had any success yet, but we've identified enough letter that it could be, I'm just saying that because it would word Morgan, but written in the old way, Morgane with an E at the end. That is one possibility out of many others. It's a mystery, and like every good mystery, you have to find all the clues before you find the culprit.
It's so interesting that so much of this is like some sort of mystery novel or something, because it inverts the sort of literary trope where there's some sinister book, that is actually full of spells or something. Well, given the genealogy of, the anti-witch sentiment, maybe that itself is much more sinister, and a book about that is really the scary thing.
And I have to specify, I think I forgot to I told myself beforehand, I have to remember this. It's probably one of the first state-sponsored witch hunt in the 15th century. Because people, as Rob said earlier, when Monty Python or, the popular culture understanding of witchcraft keeps referencing the Middle Ages. Well, there was no witch hunt in the Middle Ages. I mean, no, not in the scale that we will see basically from 1530 to 1730. Those are the 2 centuries where, if you're a conservative estimate is between 60 and 80,000 people were killed as witches. And that's not taking into account the people that were arrested and tortured and then released. So it was a real phenomenon, but it was not a medieval phenomenon, So what's also interesting with our book, it's because it's related to one of the first state-sponsored witch hunt, which settles or basically creates the preconditions for the following ones to happen. It clearly lays the ground rules, and a lot of the things that you find in the Arras trial of 1460 are stereotype kinds of things that you will find in the next 2 centuries. So that's why it's also really interesting to study this precursor in a sense.
It's also, the book is also kind of a treasure for the people of Alberta. If you're like us, and if you're inclined toward mystery and inclined toward these kinds of human stories, when we start talking about just the question of who might have owned it first and how it traveled through England, southwestern England, Wales to Canada, what we do know from some of the ownership inscription, there are all kinds of interesting stories about the people who've been involved with it along the way. I mean, one of the owners is a guy named Sir Herbert Mackworth, who was an industrialist and a parliamentarian in Southeast Wales, and he was in Parliament giving speeches about taxation of the American colonies around 1776. I mean, there's just all kinds of it's a book that is so old. I mean, one of the things too, when I show it to students, that I always emphasize is we're talking about a book here that is, 300 years older than the United States, 400 years older than Canada. 100 years, it was produced in the form you see it right now with ink that is still as vivid and as red and as eye-catching as the day it was produced 100 years before Shakespeare was born. And the lives that it's lived and the places that it's traveled, as Francois said, probably came to England in the retinue of if not an English king himself, then one of his courtiers. We know from, because it's a princely manuscript, nobody else would have been able to afford it, and because of that English script. It may well have gotten caught up in the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, and went from ownership in noble hands to ownership in some nobody out in rural England for 100 or 200 years. There are all kinds of stories attached to the book, and it really is just a remarkable treasure for us and for the people of Alberta to have, and to have the chance to keep investigating it and kind of uncovering all these layers. It's just a real privilege.
I'd like to talk about this book as a material object, because this is also a very fascinating story, because we have in North America, more especially in Western Canada, there's not that many manuscripts from the 15th century. We have some. Calgary, the University of Calgary has some. They try to specialize in Victoria as well, and in Vancouver. But our book, its physical characteristics are really giving us a peek at what was the most common type of books for rich people. For let's say royalty. And there is a painting by Roger van der Weyden, which represents an author offering a book to Philip the Good, who was the Duke of Burgundy. And when you look at the painting and you look at the book in the hands of the author, it is so similar to the one that we have here in Edmonton. It's got the covers are it's skin or leather over pieces of wood, and then it's got some metal rivets, and also it has two leather straps. It's actually a thing of beauty, and our book is fairly similar to that one, although the color has faded through the years.
Could you talk a bit more about the book as sort of an artifact? I should say that there's a digitized version available online on archive.org in the Bruce Peel Special Collections collection there that everybody can look at. And it's really striking how sort of ominous looking it is. Maybe that's just, I've been primed to see old books that way, but it really has a very striking physical form.
Our former supervisor, Andrew, used to say, and I completely agree with this, it looks sort of like the sort of book you'd expect to find in the Malfoy's library in Harry Potter. I mean, it really has that sinister sort of medieval look, precisely as Francois said, because we associate that kind of book, or that kind of image, with books that were produced in the Middle Ages for the well-to-do. And it is a really remarkable book physically, in the sense that you can deduce a lot of things just by running your hand over it, or thinking about the significance of some of the things that you see. So for instance, it has these, as Francois said, it has these knobs, or sort of these brass stands on either side of the book that stick out. The reason that's typical of a princely book, a very high quality book that would have been kept in a princely library in a form that it could be sort of rested on a shelf and then opened up. And the brass stands kept the wood, or whatever table surface that it was on, from making too much contact with the velvet. So on our book, one of the two covers, the velvet, it's original brown velvet from 550 years ago. It's still plush in places. Like, you could sort of see how it's been protected over all these years. You open up the book, and you can learn about what it meant to buy a very expensive book at the time. We're not talking about paper, we're talking about parchment or vellum, which is to say animal skins. One of the things that you note when you read the Tincture book, there aren't a lot of holes in that vellum. There aren't a lot of stitch marks. All of the edges of the pages are very crisp and precise. And what that tells us is that, when they used to sort of make parchment, when they make vellum for use in these books, they would stretch it out on a rack, dry it, scrape it, stretch it again, dry it, scrape it again, and only some of the animal skin would really be used for prime manuscript writing. It was in the center where you had fewer irregularities. It wasn't curved. It wasn't buckled. Well, it's probably calf skin, I think. It's just sort of the finest quality. It's soft and supple.
What's also really great and interesting with this book is the fact that it was produced at a moment, the exact moment in time when movable type was being invented. And paper had been in use for probably 60, 70 years, extensively by chanceries everywhere. But if you wanted to do something for rich people, you did it with vellum. And so what's extraordinary is at that time, just to give you an example, buying a book was the equivalent of buying a luxury car today. So you would have to have the equivalent of $60,000, $70,000 to invest, because it was handmade by probably three people at least. One was the person that copied it. The other one was an artist that did the illumination in the pages. And the third one was the one who did the binding. So, and sometimes, to give you an example, a Bible would take up to a year to produce. So you have to pay the salary of the copyist for a year, plus the illustration, plus the binding. So you get a sense of how luxurious the object was, and that not everybody could have one.
I was wondering about the fact that it's such a luxury item, yet it's written in the vernacular in French rather than in Latin. That just made me a little bit curious. I would have expected.
It's very significant, and it's because it's a translation. So the person who's writing this book is a churchman. Normally, and in the case of Tincture's Treatise, the original version was written in Latin. But this is a very interesting book. It is a treatise, like it sort of has an overall structure of an academic argument, such as you'd see from other people in the 15th century. But scholars have suggested that it might be a kind of a composite text, because effectively it's the structure of this book is really interesting. First of all, the author is a fanatic when it comes to witchcraft, but he's also a very good writer. And he's a former dean of theology at one of Europe's leading universities, the University of Cologne. Okay, so he knows how to write, and he knows how to write for different audiences. So his original Latin version contained one section, which is these really harsh, emotional harangues directed toward especially princes and high-level churchmen who had the power to persecute other people, telling them that, you know what, he didn't make specific reference to Arras, but it's in the context of what's going on in Arras. These people who are behaving in this way, who are having these Sabbaths and these orgies and all this sort of thing, this is such a serious problem, and it's going to bring on the end of the world. That's how serious this problem is. So it's these very almost kind of fanatical, extreme sermons addressing these audiences. Now, the second part of the book is more of a kind of a how-to guide or an explanation of exactly how witchcraft works. And in the case of sort of demonological witchcraft, it works through the intercession of demons in the world. So the second part of the book answers a whole bunch of sort of practical intellectual questions. If someone claims that a person was carried through the air at night, did that really happen, or was it just in their imagination? And does that matter? Right? Questions like that, where you sort of figure out the how and the why of the witchcraft accusations. There's scholars have thought that maybe these were different texts that were sort of brought together in this form. Again, another reason why, again, we're so lucky to have this text, because in one book, it manages to exemplify all of the tools that an intellectual in the 15th century could bring to bear if they really wanted to persecute someone. Because the first part of the book is rhetorical. First part of the book is an argument. It's a stump speech. The second part of the book is logical. It's based on kind of what's called the scholastic method, laying out premises and drawing conclusions through systematic argumentation to answer the kinds of questions, and in some cases, the kinds of questions that inquisitors might have at trials. What if they claim that they didn't intend to do this? Well, we can conclude that whether they intended to or not, these were the sorts of questions that it would wrestle with. So together, this book exemplifies the worst things that a person in a position of power and an intellectual could do to harm other people in 15th century Europe.
And the fact that it was in French is probably because he was aiming to talk to the people of power in Burgundy. So that's why this book was really aimed at the highest level of power of the elite. So because the original was probably in Latin, and the version, actually the French version has got a bit less of that scholastic stuff in some places. So that's how we know it was, I think Tinctor wanted the Duke of Burgundy and his entourage to understand how important it was to hunt the witches.
By the way, one more quick point on that, and you're right. Sorry, I didn't get to that. Was the point? Is that this was a translation for the non-churchmen, for the non-Latin speaking people, so that it could have a political effect in the society. One other really interesting thing is that we've talked about the 4 manuscript copies of this book, but also this book was one of the very first books that was ever printed in the Low Countries by a printer named Collard Mention. So people who would be sort of high-ranking and wealthy members of the sort of middle class or burgher class, they had access to this book too in French. So it had a wide reach, and that's why it was sort of deliberately translated into French.
And by the way, Collard Mention was the first printer of English books. So there you go.
Since you brought up the differences between the Latin and the French version, I also found it very funny how he refused to go into detail about some of the nature of the sacraments in the witches' Sabbath.
It does. We had to relegate the details to the footnote because it didn't appear in the French version.
And if you look at 3 books, and that's part of what we find interesting. There's 3 books that are fairly similar. There's the second book that we translated, which is anonymous, which is usually we call it the Recollectio. And it's also about the Waldensians. And it's less skillful in using the scholastic concepts, but it's more emotional, and it's written by somebody who was there when the victims were tortured. That is clear as day, because the author talks about by name some of the people that were accused and some of the tortures that were applied. So this Recollectio, another one by another guy called Nicolas Jacquier, who was living also in the Duchy of Burgundy. Those 3 books basically are like mirrors, one with the other, and they were all used to create what we will find in the Malleus Maleficarum 25 years later. I mean, we're still working right now on the original trial documents of 1460-61 were destroyed because there was an appeal made at the Parliament of Paris. And we have all of the appeals. So it's a lot of documentation and afferent documents from everything that happened, one city talking to another. Have you got the same problem with those crazy inquisitors, and they're confiscating their goods? We are protected by the Duke. So, I mean, there's all of these informations. And ultimately what happens is, for political reasons, I mean, the appellants win in 1467, okay? They win 1469. there's a judgment that, is in favor of the victims. But you have to wait until 1491. For other considerations, we're in a totally different era. All of the actors are dead and everything. But that's when, for political reason, they make a big splash about this judgment. And because they need the people of Arras to like the king and everything. And anyways, it's another story. But one of the things they do is to honor the memory of the victims. They ask that all of the trial documents from the original trial be destroyed. So that's why we don't have the original ones. We only have the appeals, which refer to it a lot. And we also have some chroniclers, one of them in particular, who seem to have in his hands the original documents, because there's some details that he wouldn't have been able to have unless he had the original documents. So anyways, all of that, those documents, we are preparing a second book on that. Translation of all of those documents. So we're 85-90% done. So hopefully by 2021, we should be able to publish it.
Just with Tincture, there's 1,000. It opens up 1,000 stories and 1,000 different sort of areas of inquiry. But the translations of these Arras documents, like it's a whole wide range of documents we're translating. So like legal documents, correspondence, chronicles. And it's just so intriguing. Like when Francois said earlier on about how, a witch hunt could start as a legitimately sort of paranoid religious accusation. But very quickly, when you have people in late medieval courts, whereas like Byzantine and feuding, as they make it look like on the BBC, right? I mean, you had one group of nobles trying to use Arras to kind of get other nobles in trouble. And we can see just the hints of these things. We don't see the full outline, but it's so fascinating that the number of human stories that these sources lead to is really interesting.
That's really interesting. And I really do recommend the book you've already published, which is the Arras treatises. Again, I think it was a great translation. Extremely fun to read. So is there anything else you would like to add?
It's Halloween. Read a book about witches, but not the usual ones. Read, a scholarly book about witches. I think you're going to learn a lot.
Well, it's scary how relevant that still feels today. Don't you think, Dan? Dan?
Where did Dan go?
Internet connection problems?
Well, I guess we'll just take a commercial break.
Yeah, okay, good idea.
As bits of sand pass from the top part of the hourglass through to the bottom part of the hourglass, so do the days of Fundrive.
Where am I?
You're safe with me, Angela.
Who's Angela? I thought she was dead.
No, you just have amnesia, remember?
No.
Well, that's all.
What year is it? You're going to have to help me out here.
Stan, it's some non-specific point in the future in which you're still the same age, but I have aged a couple of decades and am now played by an actor of a different nationality.
Tell me one thing before I go. Is there still a CJSR?
I don't understand what you're saying, Angela. CJSR? I've never heard of such a thing.
Oh!
Doctor, come quickly.
You and your dollars have the power to cancel this trope opera today and help keep CJSR's vital, original programming on the air for at least another year. 780-492-2577. You can't stop the sands of time, but throwing loonies at the hourglass itself kinda helps.
And we're back.
But still no Dan.
Belinda, I guess you can share your cursed media story. I'll try and get a hold of him by phone.
All right, here it goes.
Warning. The information you are about to hear is classed by some as an information hazard. If taken seriously, knowledge of the topic that follows could cause existential dread, nightmares, indigestion, and irrational fear of technological devices. Listen at your own risk. The story goes that it all started in 2014. It was a typical day on the Less Wrong blog. until a user who went by the name Roko changed the fate of mankind forever. First, it's worth mentioning, for context's sake, that the Less Wrong blog is a forum for academic conversations surrounding the singularity and futurism. Roko proposed the following philosophical thought experiment. Suppose in the future there is a malevolent, although well-intentioned, artificial intelligence called the basilisk, whose task is to optimize civilization. If you, having now learned of its future existence, do not help it come into being, then it will destroy you. Essentially, upon learning of this, you are presented with two choices. Either commit yourself to helping the basilisk come into existence, or do nothing and subject your future self to the possibility of eternal damnation and torture. That's a problem for future me, you might think. But is it? If this AI is all-powerful, wouldn't it be able to reach into the past and preemptively eliminate anyone who will not contribute to their existence? Couldn't you be targeted at any moment? Thus, we have an information hazard. The mere exposure to this idea is hypothetically damning. But it's just a silly notion. Who could take this seriously, you might wonder? Well, the founder of the Less Wrong blog kind of did. He called out Roko for being clever enough to come up with such a dangerous thought, but stupid enough to post it. That's not to say that he believed it was true, but that he feared the negative consequences of the post. The thought experiment goes further. This is where TDT, timeless decision theory, comes into play. This part gets a bit confusing, and it draws from an equally baffling experiment called Newcomb's paradox, which involves a superintelligent alien. The alien offers you two boxes. A has $1,000, and B might have $1 million. Your options are to take box A and B, or just box B. So it seems logical to just take both boxes, right? Here's the twist. The alien knows what you'll choose, and if it thinks you will choose both boxes, it will make sure that there is nothing there in box B. If it thinks you will choose only box B, it will make sure there's a fresh million inside. But how does it know? What if it could create simulations of you to test your decision-making? What if you're in a simulation right now? With this thinking in mind, you're encouraged to just choose box B. Always. Even if the alien tells you you chose wrong and you get nothing. You stick to your guns because it is possible that you are not the real you at that moment. And if the virtual you chooses B, then the alien will think real you will also choose B, and it will make sure you get $1 million. Are you confused yet? In the basilisk version of this experiment, you're presented with two boxes as well. But B isn't a win in this case. In fact, you hope to God that box is empty. Box A is committing your life to the basilisk. And B is maybe damnation. Your options again are to take both A and B, or just take B. If the AI thinks you will take just box B, it will make sure that you are damned. If it thinks you will choose A and B, then you are spared eternal torture in a digital hell. If you're familiar with Pascal's wager on whether or not to believe in God, then you get the foundation of this concept. It's just a bit more twisted because the AI knows what you will decide and has tested you or is testing you in simulations. Good luck fooling it. But you may be wondering, why would we make a malevolent AI in the first place? Remember what I said about optimizing civilization? Perhaps the AI was not supposed to be malevolent at all. Maybe it is truly intended for good and sees itself as bettering mankind. But in order to do its job, it needs to come into existence in the first place. So if you don't help it exist, then you are bad and thus deserve punishment. So, now that you know, what will you decide?
So, what did you two think? Pretty scary stuff, huh? Timothy? Dan? Well, I guess we'll go to commercial again.
Hello, listener. You're listening to 88.5 CJSR FM, radio that moves you. Voted the best variety radio station in Canada for the year 2077. You might be wondering how CJSR has survived in this age of artificial intelligence and flying cars. And that is through the generous donations of listeners such as yourself. To donate, call 780-492-2577 or go to cjsr.com/donate. Thank you, and have a great day.
And I'm back. Still alone. You know, they probably just turned off their cameras, so I can't see how terrified they are. It's just a stupid thought experiment. There's no such thing as an all-powerful AI that can reach into the past and destroy anyone who opposes it. Guys? Come on, this isn't funny.
This audio file was recovered from the laptop of Belinda Ongaro. Belinda Ongaro, Dan Hackborn, and Timothy Arthur went missing on the night of October 31st. They have yet to be found. Be sure to visit their Facebook page or Instagram at Shout for Libraries, or on Twitter at Shout4Libraries. You can find past episodes and an extended version of this episode on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. And don't forget to donate this Fundrive to keep radio voices like theirs alive.